She walked into the courtroom in Butler County, Kansas. Her head lowered, but her expression strangely composed, as if that day's hearing were just another routine administrative procedure, rather than the moment that would decide how many years of her life she'd spend behind bars. For causing a 6-year-old girl she had once adopted to lose her life inside her own home and then concealing that truth, right next to her bedroom for 4 long years. In the eyes of neighbors and the small community of Rose Hill, Crystina and her husband were a compassionate couple who had opened their home to adopt 5 siblings, giving them a new family. It was Crystina herself who, after being rushed to the hospital following a suicide attempt in 2024, revealed to investigators that Kennedy, the name given to Natalie after her adoption, was no longer alive, and that her body had been lying just outside in the backyard for 4 years. Once the case came to light, the story of that compassionate family collapsed entirely. At first, the story of a loving adoptive family seemed to hold up. The community believed it, but then investigators peeled back layer after layer of evidence, and everything changed. What you're about to see is the moment the truth came out. That Natalie had been shut inside a small box as a form of punishment. That her own older sister was forced to sit, watch, and report her every movement. And that when crying broke out, signaling the worst had happened, Crystina's response wasn't panic to save the child, it was a kick to the box. And every detail you're about to see has been verified through the Butler County Police Department's investigative files, Crystina Schroer's official statements, court records, and the sentencing announced on the 10th of November, 2025. This is a case that shocked the entire state of Kansas. A family once seen as a model of compassion for adopting 5 siblings had been hiding a horrifying secret under their own roof for 4 years, while the surviving children kept growing up right beside the place where their sister had been laid to rest, with no one the wiser. If you've never heard this story before, brace yourself, because what happened in Rose Hill, Kansas, in November 2020, will challenge everything you thought you knew about where discipline ends and cruelty begins, and about what an adoptive home that seems safe on the outside can actually be hiding. To understand why Crystina Schroer was sentenced to nearly 18 years in prison, and why this secret stayed buried for 4 long years before coming to light, we have to go back to the beginning, to the day the Schroer family adopted Natalie and her 4 siblings, up through the fateful night in November 2020, when everything fell apart. In the small town of Rose Hill, Kansas, a place with a population of roughly 4,000 people just southeast of Wichita, a family took shape in November 2019 that would later shock the entire community. Crystina and Joseph Schroer adopted 5 young girls at once, among them a 6-year-old named Natalie Marie Garcia and 2 of her biological sisters. Natalie had been born in July 2014 to her birth mother, Krista Helm. Once the adoption was finalized, Crystina gave the child a new name, Kennedy Jean Schroer. And with that new name came a new life inside the Schroer household, one that would soon reveal itself to be built on control, secrecy, and fear. Almost immediately after the adoption was finalized, Crystina began isolating the children she had just brought into her home. According to the Butler County attorney, she established what he described as an environment of extreme control and isolation. Cameras were installed both inside and outside the house, wired to send push notifications to her phone the instant any movement was detected, with particular attention paid to the 4 oldest adopted children. Not long after, the girls were pulled from public school entirely and shifted to homeschooling, with Crystina citing the need to protect someone in the household with a compromised immune system. No school records ever documented any behavioral issues in these children. The only paperwork that existed was a note Crystina herself had written, withdrawing the girls under what she claimed was a doctor's order. Behind that quiet paperwork, according to investigators, Crystina was also fabricating medical conditions for the children, reporting the same invented ailments to caseworkers that she had used years earlier with previous foster children in her care, apparently to increase the state assistance payments she received for their daily care. Inside that home, discipline took a disturbing shape. Investigators later learned that Crystina routinely punished the children by placing them inside boxes, ordering them to stay silent and motionless for roughly 10 minutes at a time. If a child managed to hold still for the full 10 minutes, the punishment ended and they were allowed out. It was under this exact system, sometime around November 2020, that Kennedy found herself inside a reinforced cardboard box, being punished for moving in her bed the night before. What happened next unfolded entirely within the walls of that house, witnessed only by a child. Kennedy could not stay still. She kept trying to sit up, trying to get out, and each time she moved, Crystina responded by adding more weight on top of the box, heavy blankets, a crib, and additional boxes filled with unknown items, stacking them down until the child inside could no longer push her way free. Crystina placed one of Kennedy's sisters nearby and ordered her to watch and report back if Kennedy went silent, if she stopped moving. At some point, the little girl keeping watch began to cry, telling her mother that she thought her sister might be dead. Crystina's response, according to that sister's later testimony to investigators, was to kick the box, causing Kennedy's body to fall out onto the floor. Crystina then called her husband, who was at work at the time, and told him she was taking Kennedy to the hospital. That never happened. Instead, she left the house with her daughter's body and drove for several hours with no clear destination, before eventually returning home without the child. When she came back, Kennedy's sister noticed immediately that her sibling was no longer with their mother. What Crystina had done, investigators would later determine, was double-bag the small body in trash bags, dig a hole on the family's own property, and bury her just outside the master bedroom, the very room where she and her husband would continue sleeping for the next 4 years. Throughout those 4 years, life in the Schroer household outwardly continued. The couple kept accepting Medicaid payments from the state of Kansas for Kennedy's ongoing care, despite the fact that she had been dead the entire time. No one outside that home knew what had happened. The secret stayed buried, quite literally, just steps from where her adoptive parents slept each night. The truth only began to surface in September 2024, nearly 4 years after Kennedy's death. On September 10, police responded to a call reporting a suicidal person at the Schroer home. Crystina told officers she had taken a large number of pills on top of her heart medication, saying her life was over and that no one would ever look at her the same way again. When police asked why she wanted to end her life, Crystina gave them an answer that would unravel everything. She told them she had a daughter who was, in her words, psychotic, and that this daughter had killed Kennedy by throwing her into a box and piling blankets and other items on top of her. It would later become clear that Crystina was describing her own actions, though at that moment she attempted to place the blame elsewhere. That call did not arrive in isolation. Just over a week earlier, on the 30th of August 2024, a report had been made to the Kansas Department of Children and Families, alleging that one sister had killed another inside the home. On September 3, a caseworker visited the Schroer property to conduct a welfare check. Whatever warning signs existed in that visit, the full truth would not come to light until police returned to investigate the suicide call just 1 week later. Rose Hill police arrived at the home following that September 10 call, and Crystina's own words during that encounter set off the investigation that would ultimately expose everything. Detectives began digging into the family's history, and on the 11th of September 2024, they excavated the backyard of the Schroer home. There, buried roughly 23 inches below the surface, they found human remains sealed inside a black plastic bag, tied shut. Because of the extent of decomposition, investigators could not immediately determine a cause of death and found no obvious signs of trauma or healed injuries on the remains. A later report from the Sedgwick County Forensic Science Center concluded that Kennedy had likely died from suffocation and her death was officially ruled a homicide. Detectives spoke with Kennedy's surviving sisters during the course of the investigation, gathering accounts of the box punishment system and the surveillance cameras that monitored every movement inside the house. The investigation stretched across several months and involved local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies working together, with detectives logging more than 2,000 hours piecing together exactly what had happened to Kennedy. On the 3rd of February 2025, nearly 5 months after her remains were discovered, both Crystina and Joseph Schroer were arrested. Crystina, then 50 years old, was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, 4 counts of child abuse and torture, theft, 4 counts of forgery, Medicaid fraud, and desecration of a corpse. Joseph, 53, faced charges including aggravated endangering a child, liability for the crimes of another, interference with law enforcement, theft, and Medicaid fraud. A probable cause affidavit released that February, running 42 pages long, detailed the interviews and evidence Rose Hill police had gathered throughout their investigation. In it, Crystina described finding Kennedy inside the box with blankets and objects piled on top, claiming she had attempted CPR and given the child a cold shower in an effort to revive her before ultimately choosing not to take her to a hospital, and instead driving around with her body for hours. One of the surviving children told investigators that Crystina had once shown her photographs of children strapped down and being tortured, telling her she could be next if she did not comply. The affidavit also confirmed what investigators had already suspected about the family's financial history. Crystina had been lying to caseworkers from the very beginning, reporting the exact same fabricated medical conditions for her adopted children that she had previously claimed about foster children in her care years earlier, apparently as a way to increase the amount of state assistance money she received. Joseph, for his part, initially pleaded not guilty to the charges connected to his daughter's death and waived his right to a preliminary hearing in Butler County District Court. The case moved toward resolution over the following months. In August 2025, Crystina entered a no-contest plea to 4 charges: second-degree murder, child abuse, making a false writing, and theft by welfare fraud, with her remaining charges dismissed as part of the agreement. In October 2025, Joseph entered his own no-contest plea to 2 counts of aggravated endangering a child tied to withholding food from and locking another child in the basement back in 2023, and 1 count of Medicaid fraud directly connected to Kennedy's death. His remaining charges were dismissed as part of that plea. Crystina's sentencing hearing took place on the 10th of November 2025 in Butler County District Court before Judge Jan Satterfield, who imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. Prosecutor Darren Deviney laid out in detail the extreme environment of control that Crystina had built inside her home, describing the surveillance cameras and the harsh punishments handed out for even the smallest movements at night. Kennedy's biological family attended the hearing, including her birth mother, Krista Helm, and her oldest sister, Haley Wilson. Helm asked through tears why this had happened to her daughter and not to her. Wilson told the court she could barely sleep at night, thinking constantly of her sister and unable to understand how anyone could do this to her. Throughout the hearing, Crystina showed little emotion, a detail the prosecutor later said did not surprise him. In the end, she received a sentence of 215 months in prison, just under 18 years, and will need to serve a minimum of 185 months before becoming eligible for parole. Joseph's sentencing followed on the 3rd of December 2025, in the same Butler County courtroom, this time before Judge David Rickey. Kennedy's biological family again addressed the court, asking for the maximum sentence available and saying that Joseph deserved to face the same fate as his wife. Judge Rickey agreed with the call for the harshest penalty the law allowed, telling Joseph directly that his failure to protect his children was a dereliction of his duty as a parent, a duty that extended to protecting them even from their own mother if necessary, and that his weakness offered no excuse for the tragic outcome that followed. Joseph broke down during his own statement, telling the court he was completely broken and had dishonored his family through his own cowardice and failure to act. Under Kansas law, his convictions carried a presumption of probation, so Judge Rickey sentenced him to 4 years of probation with an underlying prison term of 14 months that would only take effect if he violated the terms of that probation. He was also ordered to serve 60 days in county jail, reduced by 2 days for time already served, beginning immediately after sentencing. Today, both cases have concluded. Crystina Schroer is serving her nearly 18-year prison sentence, while Joseph Schroer is serving out his term of probation alongside the brief jail sentence he has already completed. The surviving children from the Schroer household are now receiving support from state agencies aimed at helping them recover from what they witnessed and experienced, with officials saying the goal is to give them stability, safety, and a chance at a more permanent, productive future. No public records have confirmed a formal appeal from either parent as of the most recent reporting, leaving the case, for now, closed. Though the memory of Kennedy Schroer, the little girl once known as Natalie Garcia, remains very much alive in the hearts of the family, who never stopped searching for the truth about what happened to her. The death of Kennedy Schroer reveals how easily cruelty can hide behind closed doors, even inside a home that appears, from the outside, ordinary and complete. A child who had already lost so much in her short life was failed not once, but repeatedly, by the very system and the very people meant to protect her. The clearest message from this case is that adoption alone does not guarantee safety, and that oversight cannot end the moment paperwork is signed. A home can look stable on the surface while concealing years of isolation and abuse that no one outside its walls can see. This case is a difficult reminder that silence and distance, whether from schools, social workers, or neighbors, can allow harm to continue far longer than anyone imagines. Regular, meaningful checks on children removed from public view, especially those transitioning into homeschooling with little outside contact, matter more than paperwork alone. It also shows the weight of responsibility carried by every adult in a household, since looking away is its own kind of harm. Kennedy's story stands as a call for vigilance, for asking harder questions, and for never assuming a child's safety once decisions are made behind closed doors.